Welcome back. I'm working on my weaknesses, and one of those, for you new subscribers, has been endgame tactics. I've often found myself in what's obviously an endgame, and sometimes I win and sometimes I lose, but there were things that I could have done that would have won faster or avoided losing. And I'm working through this one because a couple of moves after this, my opponent resigned. And when I analyzed the game, it said at that point I had a mate in, I think, 16. So I want to figure out what that was. Right here, I had just moved this bishop back, not knowing exactly what my opponent was going to do, but I had a plan for checkmate. I have noticed that my bishop cuts off these two squares from the enemy king, and that this pawn, my b pawn, cuts off these squares. And so right now, if I were able to check the king, it could escape here. So my plan was to first, assuming, let's say white didn't have any moves and I had 3. My plan was to move my a pawn to a6, which would cut off this square. Because remember, my b pawn already cuts off the other 2. And of course my king is protecting both of those pawns in those positions. Then my next move would be rook back to e1, and then over to a1, which would be checkmate, because again my bishop cuts off this escape square, and then so my rook would be hitting all of these. That was my plan, if I could do it while fending off my opponent. Okay, my opponent's next move was, it says that their actual best move is to move this pawn forward, but they didn't do that. And it says that their next best moves were to move this rook either to g8 or to d8. But what they did instead was move this bishop down, and that makes a fairly obvious plan. They're aiming for this pawn and then probably this pawn, hoping to advance their only remaining, one of their 2 remaining pawns. But when they moved that, the first thing that I saw was, oh, my bishop is now pinned to my rook. So if I move my rook off of this file, they can take the bishop. I forgot it was guarded by the pawn. But I also knew that I can't move the bishop. If I move the bishop someplace, then they can take my rook. But it got me to quit thinking about this plan for a second, the plan that I had already mentioned for checkmate over here on the A file, and got me to thinking about this bishop, which turned out to help me find the best move, because I was thinking, could I move the bishop somewhere that wouldn't result in me losing this rook? One thing I came up with was bishop to b3, which would be a protected check, forcing the king either to escape to the b file or behind the bishop, which would now be here, and then I could take this rook for free. Nice plan. And in just a matter of seconds, and I'm really proud that I found this, I realized that the rook and the king are on the same diagonal, and I can check and then pick up the rook this way, or with either one of my pieces for that matter. And from the timestamp down here, which says 7:19, my next move shows 7:22, which is adding 3 seconds, which means this game must have had an increment. So I spent 7 seconds and then got 10 back in order to have a net of 3. So I found that in 7 seconds, which I'm pretty proud of. And my opponent resigned at this point, once they realized they were about to lose their rook. However, Stockfish, right above my head, is saying I now have a mate in 16. So let's say my opponent hadn't resigned. Their only legal move at this point is to move this pawn forward to block that check, because their king didn't have any legal moves. Remember, my rook cuts off these squares, my pawn's cutting off this square, my bishop is now aiming at these, so the king can't move, so the pawn move is the only legal move. And I'm supposed to take the rook, which I think anybody would have done in that situation. And I assume at that point my opponent, if they had kept playing, would have taken this pawn. Now, the interesting thing to me was right here, and I haven't followed this line out yet, but it says my best move is to take this pawn. And I could, off the top of my head, I can't figure out why, because it looks like the king would just take back. So, let's figure it out. I take this pawn. It says if the king takes back, again looking at Stockfish's recommendations right above me, I'll have a mate in 3. So let's say the king took back, because I think that's what my opponent would have done if they were still playing. They don't have to take back. They can move here. But if they take back, I have a mate in 3, and it does not involve check on the first move. That's the amazing thing. Because remember my plan of moving the a6 pawn forward earlier? When the king was boxed in by its own pawn here, and my bishop was down here cutting off this diagonal. And so with my a6 pawn and my b6 pawn would cut off all 3 of these squares, because the king was up here, remember? My idea was to bring the rook around. Okay. If I check now with this pawn, the king has all of these escape squares possible. So that's why Stockfish, I just now realized, is saying my next best move is this one. I mean, my best move is here. Not a check, but my rook was cutting off these 3 squares, but now I've moved those 3 squares down. So they're not up here anymore. And now the king can't move at all, because my b pawn again is cutting off these. My king is guarding all 3 of these squares. And no matter what my opponent does, that's checkmate on the next turn. Except the one move, which they might not have found, which is to put the bishop in the way, which now my rook doesn't guard these 3 squares. So I have to take it first. But I'm very lucky that they have a pawn left, because the king doesn't have any legal moves. If I had done that while this pawn was sitting here, we'd be in a stalemate. But fortunately, it's their turn. They do have a move left. And now I have to play a6 for the win. Okay. I'm pretty sure that if my opponent had kept playing and taken this pawn, I would not have taken this. Pretty sure. But let's say that I had seen that and they didn't take back. They could have just done their other legal move. Now I still have a mate. A mating sequence that I don't think it doesn't even involve promoting a pawn, which I think in this situation almost all of us would probably check, then take this pawn. No, we can't check because then they get the bishop. Wait. But the problem was, yeah, if we check now, they can still get the bishop. But if they do, it's mate in 1. Oh my goodness. But the problem with checking now is that my rook isn't blocking off these 3 squares anymore and the king gets away. Okay. So that's the problem with that. But again, I think a lot of us would have done it, checked, and probably a lot of our opponents would have taken the bishop, and we might have been lucky to see this checkmate. But if they escaped, we still would have won this pawn, and now we're protecting this one. We have 2, 3, 4 passed pawns. And I think almost any of us would have now hurried some of these pawns toward promotion. That's what people at my level would have tended to do in this situation. But again, it says here I have a mate in 16, and the first thing is to protect the bishop, which is odd because we were supposed to give it up a minute ago. But that's our fastest way to mate, and I think it's now because the b pawn is still cutting off this square, and now with they're protecting the bishop, we're cutting off this. The pawn and the king are guarding this square, and the king is guarding this one. That king has nowhere to go. Oh, and the bishop is cutting off these 2 squares, and the rook's cutting off these 2 squares. So if white doesn't come up with a great solution, look at that. Everything is mate in 1 except bishop to c3. Because now if they just move this pawn forward or take this pawn, that's checkmate right there. The pawn to a5. Because again, we've cut off all the squares around the king. So my opponent would have to find bishop to c3, because now the rook doesn't hit these squares anymore. If they found that, I can still play check on a5, which forces a king move, and now it can go to one of the squares it's just blocked off. And if they go here, what's my move? Now I'm supposed to give, okay, I think it is going to depend on a pawn promotion. It's saying just to take the bishop, the best move, and probably any move our opponents would play would be to, any of our opponents would just take that. And now I'm supposed to come forward with the king, which forces the king. I think all of those are legal moves. It says they're all about mate in 10. But let's say they went here. I think that's what my opponent would try to do to stay close. Now we can check it with a4. Okay, so it is going to result in a pawn promotion. Is that what it is? Well, now what if the king went here? F5. Okay, we've got the king so far over there that we can promote this. Okay, they're going to try to run themselves into a stalemate, so we have to be careful. But they do have legal moves here, so we can just keep pushing the f pawn. That was the answer. Yeah. Okay. Well, I've worked this out. Thank you for watching. I hate for these game analysis or working on weaknesses videos to go much longer than 10 minutes. But yeah, back at the end of the game here, which is where my opponent resigned, I don't think I would have found that mate, but I like to think now that I've looked at it that I would have found it if they had kept playing. If they had played their only legal move, I'd like to see now that I know I'm blocking off all these squares that I could just take here. And again, almost anybody we've ever played would probably take back. And did I mess that up? Yeah, I messed that up. I had to take the rook first. Okay, so now we're going to here. So yeah, I'm still going to mess it up even though I just went through it. I'd like to think that I would see that so that when they take back, I would know to do this to cut that off and checkmate here. And maybe you will too if you didn't already see that. Thank you for watching. Let's all keep getting better.